Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Advanced Excel. I have 1 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Our topic today is going to be pivot tables, and what I've got is a couple of examples here on the workbook in front of me. I've got two worksheets, one with just some pivot table data, and then after we get done looking at that, what I have is an example of how not to set up a spreadsheet. So we're going to go into this worksheet. We're going to take a look at a few things that need to be altered, delete data that we don't need, and turn it into a workable worksheet that we can use a pivot table on. So for those of you that aren't familiar with pivot tables do a lot of the calculating for you. And the data that I have in front of me is just an example of a business for Q1. So we've got data for sales for January, February, and March for multiple salespeople. And to be honest with you, before I learned about pivot tables, which I wish I would have learned about them long before I did, this is how I would have handled the situation of summarizing this data. So I have all of my salespeople over in column A, and you can see that we've got Kathy, Michael, they're all grouped together. I have them in alphabetical order from A to Z. And if I want to pull some data out of here, what I would do in the past is I would go ahead and maybe click on row 6 and insert a row, and then come over and do a total. So I would go through each one of these salespeople, for instance, and I would create a formula that would add up the amount of sales that they made in Q1. And then I would have to go down to my next person and do the same thing. And you can see that this would take up quite a bit of time to do this. And a few years back, I was introduced to a pivot table. And I realized that I didn't need to be going to all of that hassle. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete these rows. And I'm going to click inside of my table. You can click in anywhere inside of the table. So right now I have cell A1 selected. If you want to, you can select the entire table. It's up to you. Or if you just want to work with a specific amount of data in that table, you can just select a specific amount, excuse me. One way to, a little tidbit is that if you want to select an entire table, I can hold down the control key and hit the star, and it will automatically select that table for me. So if you have a lot of data and you don't want to scroll through and select all of it, the control and the star will select the table for you. So with that selected, or a cell selected inside of the table, I'm going to go over here to the insert ribbon. And underneath the insert ribbon, I have a couple of different options. Underneath the tables subgroup, I can click on pivot table, or you can go to recommended pivot tables. And we'll look at both of those options. But for starters, I'm going to go to pivot table. And what that does is it populates this window, and it says, okay, select the table, which it automatically did for me from A1 down to D40. And I'm going to tell it that I want this pivot table to be in a new worksheet. And that's what it defaults to. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click on OK. And you'll note that now I have my pivot table data, my example worksheet, and sheet 3. Off to the right, it has each one of my table headings. So if I go back to pivot table data, you'll see that my headings were sales person, region, amount order, and month. And when I go back to sheet 3, which is my pivot table, it allows me to select data that I want it to analyze or summarize for me. So all I really need to do is, let's say that I want Excel or my pivot table to tell me each one of my salespeople. So I can put a check mark in that. Down below, you have 4 different areas. You have filters, columns, rows, and values. And as I select maybe sales per person and order amount, what it's going to do is it's not going to give me the individual order amounts for January, February, and March. It's just going to give me a total order amount for each one of my salespeople. So when I put a check mark in there, see, it automatically adds up for each one of my salespeople the sum of Q1 and then my grand total. So I can come over here and I can select different options. Let's say that I don't want the total for salespeople. I can click in region and it gives me the total for each one of my regions. Now, Excel is intuitive and it's saying, okay, this is going to be best if the region is in rows instead of columns, and the sum of order amount needs to be in values. If you prefer to show that in columns, I can simply hover my mouse over regions, click and hold down, and drag and drop it to columns. Now, I prefer the look much more in rows, so I'm going to go ahead and put it back down there. The other option that you have, let me just go ahead and turn these off for a second, is that if you want to, you can hover your mouse, let's say over salesperson, and you could drag and drop that down to rows. So you can force any one of these fields to go into the boxes that you want, or you can let Excel determine what box is best for the data that you're looking at. So when I select my salesperson and the sum of the order, I now have all of that data over here. If I want to focus on just maybe a couple of different salespeople, if I click on the down arrow, so I'm just hovering my mouse over where it says row labels. If I hover my mouse over that down arrow and click, it gives me a filter. So I've got a couple of different options. Right now, I can sort from A to Z or Z to A, or I can click in the select all box. It will deselect every single one of my sales people. And let's say I want to focus on William and Tia. So I can put a check mark in those 2 boxes, click on OK, and it filters everybody else out. Now, that doesn't mean that that data is gone. It just means that we're focusing on these 2 salespeople for the time being. If I want the rest of the salespeople back, I simply click on the filter again. I can put a check mark in select all, click on OK, and there are all of my people. And that stands true with all of these. So if I select order amount and region, I can focus on specifically 1 or 2 regions if I want to. Again, to bring those back, I just click and select all, click on OK, and there is my data. If you want to have everything in here, you certainly can. So I just put a check mark in salesperson, region, order amount, and month. And it comes up and it gives me all of the data. So it tells me that Kathy Albertson had a total of $10,725. And in each month, she sold $9,000 in January, $1,375 February, and $350 in March. It also tells me that the total sales for the East region was $12,415. So you can have all of that on your pivot table, or again, you can specify which you prefer to focus on. So just for a second, I want to go back to my pivot table data. So let's say that we're looking at this and we say, well, wait a second, this isn't correct. This was entered wrong. Michael didn't have, in the month of January, he didn't have $400 worth of sales. He had $4,000 worth of sales. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click to edit that, put another 0 in, hit the enter key. And now when I go back over to sheet 3, it's not going to automatically update that information. So if you're used to using Excel and you insert a chart and you go from one worksheet to another, if you update data or data changes, those graphs will update automatically. However, with a pivot table, what you need to do is you need to come up to the pivot table analyze, click on that ribbon, and then click underneath the data group on refresh. And if you just want to focus on Michael while I click on refresh, we should see his sales increase by $3,600. And when I clicked on that, sure enough, it did. It increased his sales to $7,300 and the overall sales to $35,240. Okay, so from here, what I'm going to do is I am also going to show you how to insert a pivot chart. So I'm going to come up here underneath the tools group. I'm going to click on pivot chart, and it gives me all of these different options. And again, this is something that you can sit and play with for, at least if you're me, you can sit and play with this for hours. So I'm just going to go ahead and maybe select a column. And I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. It will insert my graph. Now, personally, I don't like graphs to be on the same worksheet as my data. I like them on a separate one. So I'm going to come up to Design, and I'm going to go all the way over to the right and click on Move Chart. So when I click on Move Chart, it will populate this window and it says, okay, where do you want to move the chart to? I want that to be on its very own new sheet. So I'm just going to select New Sheet. It defaults to Chart 2, and I'm just going to call this my pivot chart. I'm going to click on OK. It's going to add a 4th worksheet to our workbook called My Pivot Chart, and here it is. And again, you have all the same options that you would have if you inserted a chart in Excel with all of the same data. You can play around with that. You can add things. You can delete things. But once again, if you go back to your pivot table data and you change something, let's go in and say that, let's make a drastic change. Let's say that Shannon, instead of $875 in January, let's say that she did 18,000. So when I hit my enter key and I go back to sheet 3, again, I need to go to my pivot table analyze, click on refresh, and now when I go to my pivot chart, it will make those adjustments as well. So you need to make sure that you're going back to the sheet where your pivot table was inserted and you're clicking on refresh to update those changes. So I'm going to come back over here to my chart, and you know that you can add things, you can delete things. So if I click on the plus sign, it gives me my chart elements. I can, put in an axis if I want to. We don't need that. We can put in data labels. We can put in a data table, a legend, whatever the case may be, however you want to change your chart. So what I wanted to show you, and I'm not sure if folks are aware of this or not, but I'm going to need to change my share screen real quick. And, well, hang on. Before I do that, let me go ahead and close that up for a second. I have this chart selected, and I can tell that because I've got handlebars around the edges. So with that selected, I'm going to just go to my home ribbon, and I'm going to click on copy and put that chart on my clipboard. I'm now going to open up a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share that with you. Let's see, let me pull this over to my other monitor. Where'd you go? Okay, you should be able to see a PowerPoint presentation, just a blank PowerPoint presentation at this point in time. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to my home ribbon, and I'm going to paste that chart in here. Now I have presentation 1 and my Excel workbook saved in the same folder on my PC. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to save this real quick so it saves that chart.
Julie, your PowerPoint isn't showing.
Uh-oh. Okay, thank you. Is anything showing? There we go. Now can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So I just did a copy and paste. You can see that my table is now in a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now I'm going to flip back. I'm going to go back and I'm going to share my Excel document again. There we go. Just gonna. Did you use a blank slide? Yes, I did use a blank slide. I just brought up the Q&A. So if you want to let me know, can you, now are we back to Excel now? Just make sure before I continue on, if you could. Yeah, you're welcome, Annette. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go back to my pivot table data. And again, I'm going to make a drastic increase. So I'm going to go back up to, let's go to William this time. And let's say that rather than in February, he sold $235 worth of, or had $235 in sales. I'm going to say he had 18,000. So I'm now going to go back to sheet 3. I'm going to go to my pivot table data. I am going to refresh that. So you see that it increased the sum of the order amount for William. It increased our grand total. When I come over here to my pivot chart, it increases William's sales. Now this is what I think is really cool, and I use this all the time because I do a lot with analyzing data. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you again. And you can see that automatically in PowerPoint, it updated that information. I'm not sure whether folks use that or have used that, but it's really slick for my full-time job. I do a lot. With analyzing data. Once you have everything set up in your PowerPoint presentation, you can just update the data and it will automatically update your PowerPoint for you to present with or to share with other people. Do you typically make on your charts? Brian, it depends. No, not always. Not always. It just depends on if it's going to be more productive for me to use a pivot table than I do. It just kind of varies. Okay, so let's go back. Is there any other questions while I am going to go back and share my Excel workbook again. Okay, so that's one example of a pivot table. Now I'm going to go over to my example. And this was actually an example that someone sent to me and said, I need to create a pivot table out of this. What do I do? And I know it's a little overwhelming. So I just want to, we're going to eliminate a lot of these columns, and we're going to look at some of the things that should have been done differently. So when you're looking at all of this data, the goal of this is to figure out in the various terms how many participants took various classes from individual instructors. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll over here for a second. One of the things that you don't want to do in Excel is to combine your times with your days. So this really should have been done in different columns. It should have been one column for the day, another column for start time, another column for end time, like you can see in P and Q. We actually don't need that, so I'm just going to go ahead and we'll eliminate some of that. Let's see. We don't need any of that information. Actually, I have it highlighted what the two columns that we really need. So like I said at the beginning, a lot of times people will come in and say, well, I don't know how to set up my Excel document in order for it to graph, or in order for it to insert a pivot table. And this is one of the things that folks need to learn how to do, is to not combine labels and values. That's a big no-no, because you're not going to be able to do anything with it. Those need to be separated out. So I'm going to go ahead and just, again, delete some of this information. Now you can see what they've been doing. Down here, you've got a row, in row 22, there's a sum. So they were doing the same thing that I was doing before I learned how to use pivot tables. So let me go ahead. We don't need any of this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And I'm going to delete column A. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete these rows that have a sum in them, because we don't need those. We're going to have Excel do the work for us. Just another tidbit, if I'm doing this one at a time, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my control key. So I'm going to hold down my control key. What that control key allows me to do is to select non-adjacent items. So I don't necessarily need to delete each one of these rows one at a time. I'm just holding down the control key, and it's allowing me to select non-adjacent items. So by holding that down, I selected row 175, 168, 140, 133, and 107. And now when I come up, scroll down here so you can see some of those rows, I can click on delete, or I can right click and delete. Either way will work just fine. When I click on delete, it's going to delete all of those rows at once. Okay, so now we have we're narrowing down our data. Oops, looks like we need to get rid of this row as well. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. So I'm just going to pull this out a little bit so it's easier for you to see. Okay, Now, as I was saying, what this code right here means is the first four digits, 19 and JU. That stands for 2019 in the June term. And then after that, you've got Food 222A, which is the class that was offered. Now, in order to use a pivot table and make this work correctly, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to separate out this information. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to insert a row in between A and B. So I'm going to go ahead and click on column B to select that. I'm going to click on insert, and then I'm going to come over to column A. So I'm going to come over to column A, and I'm going to select that. And I'm going to go over to the data ribbon. Underneath the data ribbon, you have the opportunity underneath data tools to use something called text to columns. And this was another great tool that I did not know existed. And I will admit to you that I have been known to go in, especially with maybe first name, last name, if they were in the same cell. So let me go ahead and just give you an example of that. So if I put in maybe my name, and let's say that I didn't want the full name to be in one column. I want it to be separated out. I want first name and last name in two separate columns. I can't tell you that, you know, I would go in, I would highlight, I would cut that out of there and paste it into another column and, you know, delete the comma. Well, you don't need to do that. I'm just going to undo that. You don't need to do that. So I'm going to show you two different examples of how the text to columns can be your best friend. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to select column G to begin with. And I'm going to click on text to columns. And it gives you two different options. And we're going to look at both of these. It gives you delimited and fixed width. And with delimited, it gives you the option to tell Excel to split into two different columns by comma, tabs, or other items that you can determine. So with that selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on next, and you can see that I can tell it that it's a tab, that it's a semicolon, that it's a comma, that it's a space, and it's not a space, it's a comma. Or if there's something else separating your two items that you want to split into two columns, you can put that in the other, just select that, and maybe it's the number 7 that is separating the two. It's not the case, so I'll go ahead and unclick that, delete my 7. Now, what it's doing down below, it's giving me a preview. It's saying, okay, this is what it's going to look like when we're done. It's going to move Julie over to the next column, which is correct. That is what we want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click on next and click on finish, and it automatically separates out those two items. And you know, I only had one name in there, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But think if you've got 50 or 60 names in there, then it can be rather daunting. Just like look at all of the data that I have right here. We've got rows and rows, 168 rows of data. I don't want to sit here and separate out the term from the class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select column A, and I'm going to go back up to text to columns. Now what you want to remember to do is to insert that column before you begin the process, because if you don't, if I would have left the actual here, what it will do is it will split out the term from the course, but it will put the course into column B, eliminating my numbers in there. So you want to make sure that you insert that column before you get started. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that. I'm going to select column A. I'm going to come over to data, go to text to columns. This time we're going to do a fixed width. And then we're going to come down, and I'm going to simply click my mouse right in between after my fourth character. So after the U, so I want 19 June to be in one column and food 222A to be in another. So I'm just gonna click. Oops, I have to click on next. There we go. I was wondering what was going on. So make sure that you click on next. And now I'm going to click, and it will put a line in between the U, which ends the term, and the F, which begins the name of our class. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on next. And you can see that it gives us an example. It says, okay, this is what it's going to look like. This is going to be the first four characters are going to be in one column, and the rest are going to be in another column. When I click on finish, it's going to come up and say, do you want to replace the data that's already in there? Well, that's why I had us, that's why we went in and inserted a column before we got started, because that's blank and it's not going to interfere with my data. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, go right ahead and replace it. And boom, it separated those two things out. So now what I want to do is, this is actually my term. So I'm just going to work with my fields a little bit here. And this is the course. And these are the participants. Change up my field so it looks a little bit more professional. Okay, so we cleaned that up. Now we're ready to move on to inserting another pivot table. And again, I can either click inside my table, or I can highlight the entire table. I can do Control Star, and it will select it for me. I'm going to go ahead and go back over to Insert. And this time, let's just click on Recommended Pivot Tables and see what it gives us. It says, okay, this is what it's recommending, sum of participants by term. So we can go ahead and click on OK. I'm going to guess that it's going to look pretty good to us. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And it inserted, I need to move some stuff out of my way here. It inserted just these three terms. Now I want to go back to my example, see how many terms I had here. And I do just have three terms. So you can do that one of two ways. You can determine what, you can tell it to insert a pivot table, or you can have it Excel insert a recommended pivot table. It's 100% up to you. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to delete this worksheet. And I'm going to go to pivot table, and we're just going to walk through that one more time. So when I click on pivot table, it selects all of your data. So it's selected from A1 to C168. And then I want to put it on a new worksheet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And indeed, it brought over that information to our new worksheet. So I'm just going to tell it that I want to show the term, the course, and the number of participants. So what it did was it broke this down by the term. So in the term at 19 of June, we had 222 participants. in 19 of September, it looks like these are actually in quarters, we had 763 participants. And in January of 2020, we had 266 participants and total of 1255. Now you have to admit that's a lot easier than going through and trying to analyze all of that data by yourself. So I'll just go ahead and I'm going to put that back in. And again, you can determine where you want this information. So I'm going to click on term and it puts it in rows. I'm going to click on participants, it puts it in value. I'm going to click on course and it puts that in rows. If you want the term in the course to be in columns, you can certainly drag and drop that up there. But again, I think that that's a little confusing to look at for me personally. So I'm going to put it back down into rows. But we're all a little bit different. We all think a little bit differently. And if that makes more sense to you to have it in the columns, you can certainly do that. Now let's go over, let's just look at some of our examples again. Let's say that, just a little review, for participants, let's say for kids 323A, there weren't 9 participants, there were 209. Again, when I change that, when I update the data in my worksheet and go back to my pivot table, I then need to go to pivot table analyze and refresh. And then it will update that information. So you need to remember to do that refresh. Let's go ahead and insert a pivot chart. So again, I'm going to insert my pivot chart. I've got all of these different options to select from. There's an awful lot of data for some of this. So now let's just go ahead and tell it that we want a bar chart this time. Let's see what that looks like. As you know, once you've selected any one of these charts, you can go back and change it very easily and see which one is best for the data that you have. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on bar chart, click on OK. It inserts the chart on the same worksheet. I'm going to go back up to format, to design. And I'm going to go to location. I'm going to tell it to move this chart to a new worksheet. And we'll call this course summary. Click on OK. And it gives us that information on a separate worksheet. So let's go up to, let's go to design, see if we can't find something that's a little bit easier to see. Okay, so there's our chart. Again, let's say that you didn't want the courses in there. So I went ahead. I can either manipulate this data from my sheet 5, which has the pivot table for the course summary. I can take the courses out. Let's say I just want to look at terms. If I deselect course, it not only takes it out of the pivot table, but it takes it out of the pivot table chart. If I put that back in, it not only puts it into the chart, but it also puts it back into my pivot table. So they're corresponding, they're working with one another. And naturally, if I go in and copy this chart and I move it to Excel, oops, where is it? There it is. If I Oh, no, that's the wrong one. There we go. If I copy and paste this into Excel and I have it in the same folder, if I update this information, it will automatically update the information in my PowerPoint presentation. So let's go back over here, and I'm going to go ahead and take courses out again, and let's use our filter and tell it that we want to just focus on maybe January of 2020. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. I'll add my course back in there, and it gives me just that information. Now, if I go back over to my course summary, it changes that on my chart as well. So you can very easily play around with this. So if you're doing a presentation, if you want to, you can do it from Excel, or you can do it from PowerPoint. So if you've got live questions that are coming up, you can very easily go in. You know, if somebody says, okay, I want to focus on just one term. So if I want to focus on a different term here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, put my courses back in. Let's say that I'm just going to focus on this information. I can look at it from this perspective, or I can go back over to my course summary and I can look at it from this perspective. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and look at the Q&A here. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, I see. Let's see. So in the chart in PowerPoint directly linked to the chart in Excel. That's correct, Annette, both of them. What if I want to preserve? So what if you want to preserve the original column? So let me go back. I want to make sure that I'm following your question, Annette. Let me go back to my data. No, where is it? There we go. Let's go back to my chat. Whoops. There it is. Okay, so Annette, you asked, what if I want to preserve the original column? I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what you're asking me. So then you're going to want to, just like I did. So I didn't want to eliminate the participants, which used to be in column B. That's why I inserted another column. Okay, any other questions? In the original pivot, the currency. So Robert, when you in your original pivot, are you referring to this information, and then I went to the pivot chart? Sorry, I've got too many things. So here's my pivot table data, and then I went to, I think it's in sheet 3. Thanks. Can you get percentages as Annette, that's a good question. And Robert, I'm still looking at yours. I've never done percentages. My guess would be that the answer is yes, because Excel is very intuitive. If you want to email me that question, I'd be happy to look into it for you. It's a great question. I'd like to know the answer myself. So you can manually go back in and insert the currency once you're in the sales, Robert, just by coming up underneath the number group and clicking on the dollar sign. Okay, other questions? Okay, if you think of something, feel free to send me an email. I always like to help people out. And I like it when you ask questions that I don't know the answer, because then I too have the opportunity to learn more about Excel or the software at hand. So here's my personal email address. If you want to email me, feel free to. Can the value be a letter? I'm wondering if Excel can tell me how many participants ordered. Sure, absolutely. You wouldn't want to use a pivot table for that though, Lisa. You would want to use a an equal count A. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to put in so if I put in equal count A, and then I have to think about this for a second. I haven't used this in a little while. Give it my range. So it told me that I have a 7. If I go up here and I delete a couple of these T's, notice that it moves it to a 5. So yeah, you'd want to use your equal count A. Other questions? We've got a little bit more time, so if you do have questions, let me know. I'd love to help you out. If not, have a great rest of your Friday afternoon and a wonderful, nice, steamy, hot weekend. You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Robert. Yeah, you're welcome, Annette. Is there a way to do? So yeah, if you go into, I don't have the data up here to do that with. I saw your question about the double axis, the 2-axis chart. But yeah, absolutely, Sharon. If you want to send me an email, I can send you an example of how to do that. So you're trying to get just a percentage of, I shouldn't have done that. I keep losing my chat box. Hang on. I tried to copy the results of the pivot table. So Annette, what type of data did you use? I mean, was it originally a percentage that you wanted it to add? Results and paste next to. So are you doing that in your pivot table or on the regular worksheet? So on the pivot table? Right, but are you on the pivot table or are you on the worksheet itself? So what I would do, let's go back over to so I would approach that a little bit differently. I would add all of these up and I would get a percentage on my actual worksheet. So let's say if I say equal, and I'm going to divide my 9,000 into the grand total, which is a 70,000. I'm going to have to make this an absolute reference. And then just copy that down. So now when I do that, I can get my percentages. Where did my... Will the percentages be relative? So on my pivot table data, what I did was I calculated the percentage of each one of the order amounts. What percentage was each one of the order amounts compared to the total for Q1. And then when I inserted my pivot chart, it allowed me to select just the percentages. So what do you mean by the denominator changes? I'm beginning to think so. Send me an email and we can set up a time to visit about it. You're welcome. Any other questions? Thanks, everybody.